During the 1960s, America saw a rise in secularism and a decline in traditional Christian faith. Sex, drugs and rock and roll were beginning to replace the wholesome ideals of the previous decade. And in 1966, a Time magazine cover simply asked in large red letters over a black background, "Is God dead?" Over the next few years, horror cinema did what it did best. It started to reflect these tensions and anxieties and this growing rift between the old guard and this new generation with new ideals. A run of hugely successful and shocking movies would explore the idea of Satanism and evil, particularly corrupting the youth of the modern world.
God is dead! Satan lives! The year is won!
The first of these movies was in 1968. It was based on a hugely successful Ira Levin novel from the previous year about a woman who is raped by the devil and gives birth to its child. The film, produced by the king of B-movies, William Castle, and directed by the upcoming, very well respected at the time, European art house director Roman Polanski, ended up becoming both a hugely commercial hit and a critical darling, and it even picked up an Oscar.
Hail Satan!
Over 50 years later, some of the stories of the real-life horrors associated with some of the cast and crew of this film are perhaps even more famous than the film itself.
But aside from all this, Rosemary's Baby remains one of the most important, culturally relevant and terrifying movies ever made.
This is no dream, this is really happening!
Join me as we continue exploring the evolution of the occult and we dive into the dark, twisted world of Rosemary's Baby.
Has an undertaste. A chalky undertaste.
Welcome back to the Evolution of Horror. My name is Mike, and as ever, I am your host. If you're tuning in for the first time, then welcome. In this podcast, we explore and dissect the evolution of the horror genre by looking at particular subgenres one series at a time. We are currently in the middle of our 5th season, exploring the evolution of the occult in horror cinema, and this is part 6, in which we're getting to the good stuff. We are going to be discussing in depth Roman Polanski's Rosemary's Baby. So speaking of which, I just wanted to take this opportunity to issue a brief, I suppose you'd call it a trigger warning. This isn't something I usually do on this podcast, but I felt like this week for this particular episode, it's probably necessary. Now, as I'm sure all of you know, what we're about to talk about, the film Rosemary's Baby, is directed by Roman Polanski. And when you discuss a film directed by Roman Polanski, well, that brings with it a whole lot of baggage, and that opens up a whole plethora of other conversations. And I just wanted to sort of warn everyone now. Obviously, as part of this conversation this week, me and my guest, we do talk about the crimes of Roman Polanski, the sex offender. We do, of course, acknowledge this. But what we're here to do really is to talk about horror cinema and to celebrate horror cinema. And so we do, of course, spend the bulk of this conversation celebrating this incredible movie, Rosemary's Baby, and both me and Jen are huge fans of this movie, so we really do spend a lot of time celebrating this work and celebrating Roman Polanski's directing in this. So if anyone's going to be uncomfortable with that, or if you'd rather not listen to that, I totally get it, and I'm just giving you this warning now. If you're not interested in hearing us gush over a film like Rosemary's Baby, then feel free to check out and join us again next week. I will totally understand it. But like I said, we do touch on the tricky topic of art versus artist, and I think Jen and I are both of the same opinion that a movie as incredible as Rosemary's Baby isn't just made by one man. You know, it takes a whole team of incredible people, actors, writers, producers, set designers, cinematographers, various other people to make a movie like Rosemary's Baby. So we didn't want to let the actions of one man ruin the experience of celebrating and enjoying this movie. So just wanted to get that out of the way before we get into our conversation. Okay, joining me to discuss this incredible movie is one of my favourite guests. She was here back in the Ghost series discussing The Innocents with me. She joined me during the Folk Horror series to discuss Witchfinder General, and during our Zombie series she was here to discuss Dawn of the Dead. And here she is talking about a film that I believe she's a rather big fan of. So it is my great pleasure to welcome back to the podcast Jen Handorf. Hello.
Hello.
How have you been?
I'm well. It's just been, we've just had October and it's fall and I'm pretending like it hasn't happened, like, you know, that Halloween hasn't left. I'm just
no, totally, it's great.
I feel like if people can leave Christmas decorations up until February, I can leave Halloween decorations up until
100%. And I was walking here. Well, I kind of love this time of year, and I was walking here. It was like 5:30 in the afternoon, but it was pitch black. Everything kind of smelled like bonfire outside. I was like, oh, this is my favourite time of year.
That's the fly tip down the road. And you know what as well, that we've got a huge number of English oaks that line the roads up to here, so it's all very crunch. Oh
yeah, it's very Haddonfield in Halloween.
It's gorgeous.
It's
great.
I
feel you on that.
So good. So we're talking about these kind of like occult movies this series, movies that deal with kind of witchcraft, Satanism, all of that kind of thing. Do you like those types of films that deal with this kind of subject matter?
I do. I love it, and it's one of the reasons I love it is that it often plays with one of the themes that I find most terrifying, which is gaslighting, which is obviously, you know,
we're going to get into that.
Well, exactly, and predominantly we see that around female characters, and you know, as a trope, but it's a terrifying thing to me, the idea that you think everyone's out to get you and no one believes you, and they convince you that you're wrong, and then it turns out like it's a paranoid's worst nightmare.
Yes.
It's like,
totally.
And the element of witchcraft gives us that balance between the natural and the supernatural, to play in a real world and have that questioning. Even if you go into modern witch movies, like I say modern, like Blair Witchcraft, Blair Witch Project rather, and this kind of thing, it's still very much that question of, is it real? Is it not real? How can this be real? Yeah. In the words of Rosemary, this isn't a dream.
Yes, this is really happening.
This is really happening.
Yeah, it's so true. And the figure of the witch in general is really interesting, isn't it? Because actually, weirdly, I realised there are probably more movies that aren't horror movies about witches than there are horror. You know, like I think the witch has turned into this much more empowering figure than something than a monster, like a vampire or whatever. You know, which really it's kind of been reclaimed, I suppose.
Well, and it's one of the few specifically gendered monsters, I think, as well, without being rah-rah about it. But even if you think of a vampire, you actually think of Dracula, but he is the iconic vampire. You know, yes, there's warlocks, but like, let's be honest, warlocks always feel a bit like, damn squib.
I think if you picture a witch in your head, no matter what kind of witch, the sexy witch, the hag, the crone, whatever, it's always a female, exclusively female.
Exactly. I suppose there, you know, I'm sure somebody will say it is the vernacular, but easily it's the witches who end up being in the films, not the warlocks.
Yeah.
And it's you know, I think what makes them interesting as characters is it's a chance for, it is quite gendered. It's a chance for a female character to be all powerful. Yeah. You know, it's an inherent difficulty with a female villain is that she can't physically overpower her male hero, as it were. Yes. But if she's a fucking witch, she can get in there. You know, she can make it happen.
And actually, we've talked before about Witchfinder General, which was this same year as Rosemary's Baby, and that was it came at it from the place of witches aren't real, and it's the Witchfinders who are the antagonists, the evil ones. And these kind of movies kind of flip it the other way and go, well, maybe the devil is real and witches are real and black magic is real and all that kind of thing. Do you think that movies like this now still have that same power to scare us in this kind of like very secular, non-religious world that we now live in 2019?
Oh, absolutely. And I think it was really, really interesting reading some of the press clippings and responses to this film of the time. And there was real worry for satanic panic, and people are really going to know. People are going to know about the devil. It's like, bitch, the Bible's like 1,000 years old. Yeah. Like, it's not like 2,000 years old. It's not like people are, even older with Old Testament. I don't want to get in a cul-de-sac there. The Bible is very, very old. People know about the devil. He's not for new. But also, I think it's more that people began to see the fantasy of the devil and the idea, you know, this is something that was very popular in the Middle Ages, the fantasy of the devil. It's in a lot of the artwork. It's in a lot of the artwork of the 16th, 17th, 18th centuries. And we see it disappear in particular, you know, I'm sure better art historians than I could combat this, but you know, sort of mid to late 1800s, early 1900s, things got a lot more modern, and modern meant modern life. Yes. And there wasn't really the same kind of place for the devil in that modern life. And even as we go through World War I and World War II, and iconography got very like heroic and this kind of thing, we're still, even though, you know, Catholicism is thought of as a minority, like all this kind of stuff was bubbling in the background. So I think when we had this backlash of morality in the late 60s, early 70s, it had to take a pillar from which to stand.
Yeah.
And that pillar was, oh my God, people are talking about the devil.
Yes.
It's
yeah,
like,
yeah.
well, yeah.
Yeah, totally. And actually, if anything, I think in the 60s, people started to kind of embrace it, find it cool. You know, you look at the music of Led Zeppelin and The Doors, and some of this, basically counterculture was starting to embrace the occult in the 60s, right?
Well, and quite famously, and we'll probably get into some of the history, is like, obviously there's a quite famous connection with this film and the occult, in that, you know, his wife was murdered by obviously quite a famous serial killer.
Yeah, there are so many connections to do with this film, right in the center of everything.
It is.
Yeah.
It's quite historically, and it's. I was thinking about it with all of this going on. It to me is the, you know, just to say it's the quintessential evolution of horror film. Because what it is, you know, we have talked about zombie movies and giallo, and some of these words choke in my throat, so just bear with. But this is really represents the Hollywood blockbuster's ascension into, and I shudder to say it, elevated horror. Excuse me. It's a bad word. I don't like saying it. But it's funny because you look at and you have to understand, like, this came from Hollywood elite producers.
Right, exactly.
Like, this came from the top of the top, and it started with, obviously, one of horror's godfathers, William Castle.
William Castle. Do you know, I always forget, and I'm always shocked to see when the opening credits of Rosemary's Baby come up, that it's William Castle who made this, because it's like, what? You know?
It's outstanding.
It's incredible.
It's absolutely outstanding.
This is the guy that was planting little electrodes in seats and flying skeletons over audiences a few years earlier.
Exactly. Well, and see, this, I think, because what it represents, and its pivots on William Castle's involvement, is William Castle knew how to shock people.
Yeah.
And this is exactly what people mean when they describe something as elevated horror, is that he pivoted from the visceral shock to the emotional trauma.
Totally.
And that is completely visible in this film. Now, the thing you have to know too is that he got the book as an advanced copy before it was published. So William Castle could not have gotten access to this project if he hadn't been the famous B-movie filmmaker he was.
Interesting.
It was
right.
that got him access to this preview copy. He brought it to his film Robert Evans, who, if you've ever seen the documentary The Kid Stays in the Picture, you'll know intimately, but he is the quintessential big sunglasses, honking great cigar, the kid stays in the picture. Like, that is Robert Evans.
Right.
So William Castle goes to, and I think it's Paramount, but it's kind of irrelevant, but I think it's Paramount. But he goes to Robert Evans to pitch the film, and he's like, here's the pre-released book, Robert. I think you're gonna love it, but I want to direct. And so, and the thing is, Castle had directed several films.
Yeah.
Some of his more well-known were long-lasting films.
Yeah.
But at that time, Robert Evans, who is hailed as clever and tasteful, and while he was never a creative himself, he knew how to pick and select and supervise them, said, absolutely not. There is no fucking way I'm letting you direct this picture. And in fact, I've seen a little film by a European guy. The film's called Cul-de-sac. And I think he'd be great for this.
Yeah.
And so, you know, it started off, it is a producer's movie.
Yes,
which
totally.
A lot of elevated horror is. People think of it as an auteur medium, but really a lot of this stuff comes from packaging.
It's so interesting, and I think that's very relevant to what we're going to get into in a minute about whether or not you can, you know, a director of a movie can put you off a movie. But yeah, no, I think that's a really interesting place to start, actually, that it is this big package studio film. And you're right, I think I had never thought of it before, but you're right, it is a kind of early example of an elevated horror, because I think now we hold it in such high esteem. It won Oscars, you know, it really was this like darling, wasn't it? And everyone wanted to be in it, and everyone wanted to have something to do with it. It was one of those movies.
Absolutely. And it's one of the things they talked about, Castle and Evans talk about, as they talk about casting for this film, film is they talk about how Audrey Hepburn had been, I can't remember if nominated or won, but an Academy Award for Wait Until Dark, which is a tremendous thriller.
What a film.
I adore her anyway, but oh my God, I love that movie.
I'm always surprised that isn't included in more like best of the ever jump scares kind of lists, you know, because it really made me jump out of my skin.
I think like they visibly throw a cat at her in the middle of that film as well. And for viewers who don't know, she's blind in the movie, so they don't really need to throw the cat at her. The cat could just be stood there. Yes. It would be fine.
Totally. It's great.
It's purely for the audience's benefit that they threw this cat. Someone call PETA. But yeah, no, they talk about that film a lot, and they say, well, it's not that because that's a thriller. Yeah. It's a different kind of picture, and they didn't quite know how to resolve themselves with the fact that there's the devil raping a woman in a scene. It's very much there. I mean, there's giant foam devil fingers, which I never remember as being as camp as they are when I see them.
It's actually an incredibly camp movie at times.
But then it comes back to William Castle.
Yes.
And it's like, this is his business.
Yes.
And you begin to see how the studio said, no, it can't be a William Castle movie. It has to be a thriller. And Castle's coming in with his drama and his audience pleasing. And so, okay, so let's go back to getting the director on board.
Yeah. So obviously, William Castle kind of launched this whole project, and then obviously it wasn't William Castle directing it. It was Roman Polanski.
No, and William Castle, being the businessman he is, understood, great, well, if we can get this kid over, because he was a very young man at the time, and he had done Repulsion, and he had done
Knife in the Water.
And he'd done another one in Cul-de-sac, and Cul-de-sac was the one that Robert Evans had seen and wanted to bring him on board for. And I love this because one of my favorite things about these kind of DVD extras that are floating around is when you see them when they were recorded like decades apart, because the people interviewed are clearly wearing different clothes and different styles, and the stories are word for word identical.
Oh God.
And both Polanski and Evans are guilty of this in their extras. So don't feel like you have to watch both of them, whichever side you pick. You just, you can fast through. It is literally word for word the same story. Their publicists are very good. But the story that both of them tell repeatedly is that and I find this brilliant but naff at the same time, is that apparently Polanski was a big fan of outdoor sports and skiing and this, that, and the other. And Robert Evans knew this. And in fact, Polanski was in California skiing when he got sent this script, which was about skiing by Robert Evans, but also the pre-released book of Rosemary's Baby. And he said, great, there's the skiing movie, I want you to do it, but first I want you to read
this.
Read this other thing. And as all of the stories go, it was the same thing on The Exorcist. They talk about, and then I read it through the night and I couldn't put it down, and I immediately called him the next day. It's like, okay, it was a good book. We get it. And he said, but I thought you wanted to do the ski movie. And it's, I love the Robert Evans again, like super producer's producer, not always a great human being, but I love that he just sent him the skiing script because he enjoyed skiing, and was then like, put BT dubs, the devil rapes her. It's like, no, this one. Let's do this one. Fuck the ski movie. That sounds boring. But it's and you can imagine why, Cul-de-sac, but to me Repulsion is really the ground for evolution.
Well, that's why I was surprised actually that you said it was Cul-de-sac that this producer had seen, because it feels like such a kind of, it's got so much in common with Repulsion, which is, for anyone who hasn't seen it, it's this British set movie, isn't it, about this woman played by, I think, Catherine Deneuve, who is essentially, it's her on her own in a flat for most of the film, isn't it? And this kind of story of this woman on the verge of a nervous breakdown,
whether or not you're Cassavetes or not,
basically, isn't it? And it's pretty. I mean, we'll get to Roman Polanski, but I think
we'll save some of that for a bit.
Yeah, but most people can, I'm sure, probably agree that the filmmaking in Repulsion is pretty astounding. I mean, in terms of the way that film is directed,
and just in sheer screen time, how many films of this era have featured a female protagonist playing her own character, going through this again, gaslighting, nervous breakdown, sort of surreal experience of terror, and the comparison there is huge. Now, where they aren't similar is in the type of women they are.
Yeah.
And so this brings us into casting, which again, so casting at the time, we were still at the end of the studio system.
Yeah.
So there were people who were actors who were contracted to the studios to play certain parts. And the actor they wanted, rather than Cassavetes, was Robert Redford.
Yes.
Except they were also suing Robert Redford. The studio was suing Robert Redford at the exact same time as the offer went out.
Oh, wow.
And so Robert Redford got on his motorcycle and rode off and said, fuck you. And that is how how Evans tells the story. So they didn't get Robert Redford, and everyone's going, oh God, but he would be so good. And not being funny, I think he would have been amazing. I also think there's reasons why Cassavetes was better, and I'll go on to those in a bit. And it's to do with the relationship with the director, which will come in a later conversation.
Right, that's interesting. Jack Nicholson also auditioned for the part as well. Of Guy.
So, and this is interesting, obviously, because it ties into both Chinatown and
real
things
life
we'll
stuff.
talk about later in this podcast.
Yeah.
But so all these guys came out for it, and actually the director had known Cassavetes, and Cassavetes himself, both the director and an actor, and obviously Polanski also himself an actor and a director. And they knew each other from the scene, and Polanski thought, this is going to be a great idea. I want Cassavetes to come play this guy. I think he's going to be great at it. And okay, so they've got Cassavetes. In the meantime, Polanski, and in fact, he claims the original novel, and I need to go back to the descriptions of the novel to see if this is true. But he says he wanted, and he keeps using this phrase, a milk-fed, all-American woman.
That's right.
And
yes.
Not being weird, I always just think that means big boobs.
Well, that's
I sort of feel like.
Yes, totally. And I can't remember what I read or how but that is essentially what he wanted, right? He didn't want this kind of like wafy, what he ended up having,
Well,
right?
he wanted Catherine Deneuve, right?
Yes.
He wanted,
yes.
and he even said, he even put forward his wife Sharon Tate for the role. So he
The
put forward
producers
Sharon
didn't
Tate,
want her, did they?
exactly. And who Robert Evans wanted was Tuesday Wells, actually, the director put up as well. But
Yes.
who Evans wanted was he wanted Mia Farrow.
Yeah.
And there were two reasons they said they wanted her. They wanted someone who didn't quite have a major identity, but was known.
Yeah.
And she had been on a long-running TV show, so she was known to a lot of America.
Right.
But also because she had just gotten married to Frank Sinatra. And
God.
this is so very of today. If
Yeah.
Frank Sinatra was Tom Cruise, you could absolutely see this happening today.
Yeah.
And so she was married to Frank Sinatra, so she had this high profile. But then so they're doing, okay, you know what? Let's jump forward now, because they're doing the movie, and this Frank Sinatra thing plays out. And it plays out into why I think Mia Farrow ended up being the ultimately correct person for this film. And that is because 3 months into filming, what did you call him? Travolta. Sinatra
Yes.
read the script and told her, you're not doing it. And rumor had it was because of the nudity, but then they got in a fight. No, you're not doing it. Sinatra's wife isn't doing this. She said, no, I am doing it. She went to Robert Evans and said, I don't know what to do. Frank's going to divorce me. And Evans showed her apparently an hour of the footage and said, you're going to win an Academy Award. No, she didn't. She was nominated, but she didn't win. And she said, okay, I can deal with the divorce then. And that, to me, it's just, the whole thing is so very Hollywood.
Oh God, it's so Hollywood. It is like, it's the quintessential Hollywood movie of the 60s in some ways.
He delivered the divorce papers to her on set. And we know this, and this has become the stuff of legend. And I think when you think of her and her character, she is dealing with what Rosemary is dealing with, this alienation of someone she thought, who was in the entertainment business, who she thought loved her, and who she got ditched by. And so I think a lot of what we see in her performance comes to real life there.
I think there's a lot going on in this film that is very much ringing true of what's really going on in real life in Hollywood at this time, right? And that's partly what makes the film so powerful, and partly what makes it so frightening and hard to watch at times as well,
Absolutely,
I think.
absolutely.
And we're going to talk about, we've already recorded it, but in a couple of weeks' time, we'll be talking about The Exorcist on this podcast. And that is another movie in which it's almost like the stories of what goes on behind the scenes of that movie are as famous, if not more famous, than the film itself, right? And it feels like these films are mythic in some way, you know?
Absolutely,
It's
absolutely.
crazy.
And part of it is the individuals attached to them, and part of it is the bigger stage of, the bigger world stage that's attached to it.
Yeah.
Obviously there's a lot of publicity around the celebrities involved in this film.
Yeah.
A lot of very bad publicity.
Yeah.
A lot of drama and hurt and intrigue and this kind of stuff.
Well, we'll get into the film properly, but let's just address the rapist elephant in the room, as I put it earlier. Let's talk about Roman Polanski for a minute. So I'm sure everyone out there knows, and everyone everyone has their own views on this, and I feel like it's a very hot topic right now.
Here's the thing. Here's what we know. We know that Roman Polanski was found guilty of having sex with a 14-year-old at Jack Nicholson's pool party.
Yes.
During some photo shoot or something, and the trial also found him guilty of dosing her with drugs before she did that.
Yeah.
That is what has happened in a court of law.
And this happened, we should say, in 1977, so 9 years after Rosemary's Baby.
9 years after Rosemary's Baby. Now, here's what else we know, and this for me is the bottom line, is that Polanski was 43, and this young woman was 14. Mm-hmm. And
Even 13, I think.
13, there you go.
She was literally a kid. And another thing that we know for a fact is that he pled guilty and then he fled the country. And famously, of course, Roman Polanski went over to Europe and has been there ever since, and has never returned to America, and has never done his time, so to speak. He's never been sentenced, and nothing has ever progressed since that trial in 1977.
Now the victim,
the victim, Samantha Geimer,
and she has gone on the record to say that she doesn't feel she was overly scarred by this, and actually she wishes that the press coverage would just stop.
Yeah.
Because the press coverage was actually more damaging for her than the event itself.
Yeah.
And I don't disagree with that either. I think it's fair enough that she doesn't want this drawn on any longer. Now, the other side of this is recently, I believe another 4 women have come forward claiming that Polanski had assaulted them. This is all previous to 1985. These are historical events, not that diminishes them at all. So I want to go with the fact, and here's what I'll say about separating the artist from the art here, because we have to take all of this on board when we talk about this guy's film.
Absolutely.
And I do personally have to say, yes, I feel conflicted. It is my favorite film, but he sounds like a prick. He sounds like a terribly boring old man who likes to have sex with young women and found himself caught up in a lifestyle that he thought suited his ego. And that doesn't make me feel very nice about him.
No.
He's a prick. Picasso was a prick. I don't like him. Some of his art I find very moving. I don't think we have to like the artist to find the art interesting.
Yeah.
Now, will I pay for his future movies? Will I do this? Will I support him as an artist? He can go fuck off. But
yes.
I think,
and actually, I just want to say, just to interrupt slightly, I think another interesting thing / quite scary is that obviously he continued to have a career after 1977, right? So for the last 30, 40 years, he has, of course, continued to make movies. He made The Pianist in 2002, which won him a Best Director Oscar. Of course, now he couldn't turn up to the ceremony, but Hollywood at the time, less woke Hollywood at the time, gave him a standing ovation, in his absence.
And the Oscar goes to Roman Polanski for The Pianist. The Academy congratulates Roman Polanski and accepts this award on his behalf.
So the purpose of art is to stimulate a feeling or stimulate a response to a piece, and monsters are stimulating.
Yes.
So we are people who love monster films.
Absolutely.
And sometimes there are monsters who make them.
Yeah.
And well, I was going into this and talking about how Polanski related to his actors. So he talks a little bit about this, and you can extrapolate more from what the actors themselves say. But basically, Polanski and Farrow got on very well. Yeah. She saw him as sort of an older brother. He was a very specific director. He said, do this, this, and this, and he'd show her, and then she'd ape it, and that would be the performance in a way. And he himself said that he has always found it easier to work with female actors, with actresses, because he finds that they're more open to the instruction of the director and they're more willing to trust and take that leap. He said that conversely, he had problems working with actors, with male actors.
Yeah.
And Farrow describes his relationship with Cassavetes as at the beginning they rode motorcycles and they went off in New York at the beginning of the filming and they had their lads' nights and this, that, and the other. But Polanski liked to work structured. Here's the blocking. Here's the beats. Here's the positions. And Cassavetes liked improv.
Yeah.
And Cassavetes got increasingly frustrated throughout the production and became more and more of a prick on the set because of this. And eventually everybody was fine, but there was always this tension. And I think that feeds brilliantly into this character.
Yeah.
The way that Cassavetes, you can tell there's an element of tension in the way he holds himself where he feels like he's having to perform in a certain way.
Yeah, there's something awkward almost about him, isn't there?
And I honestly, that's exactly who his character is meant to be.
Yeah.
But I think it's luck in a way that means that this real life actor who's used to being fluid and improv-y and having control suddenly being dictated every motion, just as this character Guy was having dictated to him by the Coven.
Yeah.
Gets you this very stilted sort of powerful man being brought down into a little box performance.
Totally.
And equally you see, Mia Farrow's relaxation and conviction and earnestness because that's what she was doing with Roman. And, as much as, yes, Polanski comes in with his ideas and his vision, you've got to give credit to the situations these people themselves were experiencing and what they brought to these characters.
Absolutely.
I'm not sure I would have liked Catherine Deneuve's Rosemary.
Well, it's hard to picture anyone else, isn't it, now at this stage? But yeah, you're right. And I think, going back to what you were saying about separating art from artist, I'd love to know, I mean, you've produced movies before, and I'm sure you must know better than anyone that a director is but one cog, right, in a bigger machine.
Well, this is the thing. And there are some spectacular collaborators on this film. I mean, his cinematographer is fantastic, and they had a brilliant relationship. But really, because Polanski knew his lenses. Polanski was someone who really dictated a lot of what he wanted from those sort of images. Mm-hmm. And you can see this in his depth of field. You can see this in his framing. He does a lot of wide shots with either infinite focus or, very shallow depth of field where you suddenly rack to a character in the background or the foreground. And he's great with that. So he doesn't lean into that as much as he winds up leaning into people like his costume designer and his production designer.
Right.
Now his production designer is Richard Silbert, who was a twin. Uh-huh. And his brother helped him out with his work. And the exteriors were all quite famously that building what is in New York, what John Lennon got shot in.
Yes,
which is how I always remember it, but it's some famous.
I've forgotten what it's called now, but yes.
That one.
You all know if you're listening. You all know the building we're talking about.
You have Wikipedia at home. You can figure it out. But the interiors were all sets, and they looked everywhere for these appropriate flats, but they couldn't find them. They of course couldn't get permission to film in this building that all these celebrities lived in. So they built a whole set in Los Angeles.
Incredible.
And that location, that interior set, oh my God, like as a creative, it's a dream. It's beautiful. The way it transforms from this old witchy woman's house into this big white space, and the two flats mirror each other, and it's just the whole thing is delicious.
That is wonderful. Well, I think it's time. Let's get into it. I mean, we've discussed the background behind this movie. We've discussed a lot of the kind of facts and the stories around the making of this movie. Let's delve into the film itself. So here we go. Let's begin our in-depth review of Roman Polanski's Rosemary's Baby. First of all, Jen, What do you think of Rosemary's Baby? Do you like Rosemary's Baby?
I bloody love this film so much.
I think I heard you mention earlier, it's your favourite film, did you say?
It is my actual favourite picture.
Oh my God.
And it has been for a really long time. From when obviously it was made before I was born, but I watched it really young because it was one of those that didn't have as Robert Evans tells us, didn't have a lot on screen as far as gore is concerned.
Yeah, totally.
And I just, Mia Farrow, man, I was drawn to her and that haircut and the sort of, it was just the whole thing. And, it's an absolutely spectacular film, not just as a horror watcher, but as a filmmaker and as a lady.
Yeah.
So yeah, absolutely, hands down, always loved it. Amazing
So
film.
interesting. It is. I think it's wonderful as well. I watched it for the first time in quite a few years actually this week, and I was just like, fuck it. I almost couldn't fault it. What I find really fascinating about it is that it's about, and we'll get into all this, but it's about so many things. It's about abuse and gaslighting, like you said, and marital rape, all kinds of other stuff. But it's also this campy movie where like naked old people tiptoe about in the background of shots.
Pre Ben Wheatley, naked old people. It's like, no, and it's that's the thing, is it's like, this is a William Castle movie through and through. Yes. There's a naked woman who, by the way, is not Mia Farrow but a body double, because Mia Farrow was a good Catholic girl and refused to do the nudity scenes. But yeah, no, there's this naked painting of blood on a woman's body and lots of nipples and like naked old people wandering around, and then the big foam-handed devil raping the naked bloody woman. It's like
insane.
You can't go, it's not like BBC.
Yeah.
It's still super B movie.
Totally, yeah, it is. And maybe that's why it ended up being such a critical and commercial success, is that it has that kind of popcorn campiness to it, whilst also, if you want to just look slightly under the surface, there's a whole other world of kind of quite dark, insidious stuff, right?
I have to point out like a little bit more of production backstory amazingness, which is that Mia Farrow was meant to go co-star with Frank Sinatra directly after the shooting for this. And that was one of the problems, and one of the cruxes of their issue was that the shooting for this kept going on and on and on and on and on, and it went massively over budget, an entire $2.2 million. And it's like, that was their whole budget. I'm like, oh, you goddamn. And so the schedule kept pushing and pushing and pushing, and so obviously when they got divorced, she got cut from the film, and he went on and made this film anyway. And his film opened the same weekend as Rosemary's Baby, and she slaughtered him. I know, it's like, what whatever bad luck people say is around these kind of films, it's like, dude, no, you got your sort of mic drop box office moment with
Absolutely.
Frank Sinatra. How's that feel?
So good. Well, let's start by talking about Mia Farrow then. And like you said, you couldn't imagine anyone else in this role. What is it about her? I mean, like, what is scary about it, I think, is that she does at times, the actress herself, look so unbelievably skinny that like she does look like she's ill, right? And apparently she lost a lot of weight because of the stress of what was happening to her in real life with her divorce and Frank Sinatra and everything. But that adds so much more. But aside from all of that, it's just a tremendous performance too, isn't it? That's the thing.
Well, and I think, I don't want to make a judgment here, but I do think Farrow as a human being is a little bit unhinged. Like, Evans described the reason that he wanted her was because she had this sort of depth to her, this something else to her. Yes. And I think she does, but I think that's, like, she's got a sort of yearning behind everything. And you look at the tragedies of her life and the tragedies of her relationships, and you can see how that yearning crosses over into her human life. And it's a real tragedy. I don't necessarily know how much of it is a performance and how much of it is her being her own essence and just embracing her own fragility.
I think that's right. And there are moments, I think, like we talked about already, but like there are awkward moments to her performance, as well as Guy's, as well as Cassavetes' performance. But it kind of works weirdly in this kind of like quite dreamlike world of this film at times, Well,
this is fantastic too, because there's when she calls up the actor who supposedly Guy has replaced because he's been blinded. Polanski describes it as a prank, but their mutual friend Tony Curtis, was visiting the set, and apparently she hadn't seen Tony yet, and Polanski thought it would be a funny joke. I find that weird. This is why he went over schedule, is that he's like, I'm just going to have my friend visit set, and then also I'm just gonna pop him on the phone as a prank for a take or two.
Yes.
It's like, no wonder you're fucking over schedule. You're bucking about on set all day. But so he put him on the other end of the line for that phone call.
That's right.
And apparently, yes, part of the look on her face, which is one of sort of bewildered confusion, is that she recognized her friend's voice but couldn't place it.
This is Rosemary Woodhouse. Guy Woodhouse's wife.
Oh, yeah.
I want to
My
know.
God. You must be a happy little lady these
I
days,
just-
huh? Living in the brown, rows of uniforms.
I wanted to know how you are, if there's been any improvement.
Well, bless your heart. Guy Woodhouse's wife. Well, I'm splendid. I've only broke 6 glasses today.
God, it's just riddled with these like Hollywood backstories.
Well, this is
isn't
the
it?
thing. It's absolutely its foundation is on the reality of who these people were and what they were going through at the time.
Yeah.
And I sincerely believe it comes across on screen. It really does. The depth of it is there.
It does. It's true. We've basically, I don't think there's anyone that really needs us to spell out what the story of this movie is, but essentially, you know, Rosemary, she moves to this apartment, doesn't she? And she meets these 2 neighbors. And then what happens is the husband essentially kind of sells her to Satanists, essentially, and sort of says, yeah, you can use my wife as this vessel to give birth to the devil's child.
As you do.
As you do, for his acting career.
As you do.
And
that, by the way, number 1 tip on how to break into acting. Sell your wife's preborn child to some Satanists next door.
Well, that's the other really funny thing about it, is that I do think it's kind of poking fun a bit at Hollywood and acting and that world as well, and commercials and all of that stuff. But anyway, like this idea that there are, and you talked about how the production design even reflects this in the way that the flat next door is the mirror image of this flat, and it almost feels like there are like 2 stories going on at the same time.
Absolutely.
The one that you don't see and the one that we see.
Oh, the off-screen is amazing in this picture.
That's what I love about it. And right, I want to ask you a bit about, like, because I can't remember now what I thought the first time I watched this, but like the way that Polanski, or the way that this story drip feeds you information, are you supposed to know from the beginning what the deal is, and in terms of like that Guy is the one that's made this deal, that he's in on it too, that everything is kind of orchestrated to control her and gaslight her? Or is it more of a mystery where you don't know what's going on as well as Rosemary? Because I can't work that out.
So first I'll tell you what I think happens, and then I'll tell you what I think the audience's relationship with that is meant to be.
Yeah.
The first night that they go over for dinner, that Rosemary and Guy go to Minnie and Roman's for dinner.
Yeah.
For a leg of lamb that's frozen. It's completely frozen, but in 3 hours we'll eat it. That immediately bothered me, but that's fine. But so there's a bit where Rosemary and Minnie go off into the parlor or whatever to have a conversation about something else, the plants or something, kitchen, I think. And Roman and Guy are left. And when they walk in, Guy looks a bit like the cat with the canary. Mm-hmm. Like he can't quite believe what he's been told.
Exactly.
And then he stays a bit longer and hears some other stuff. And then he goes back to their house the next day and hears more from them. I think this is when they've pitched it.
Totally. It's there and then. It's when she's washing up in the kitchen.
Exactly. And I think when he gets the call, you see the realization. He thinks it's a joke. He's like, yeah, fine, whatever. Sure, you can have my firstborn child if you make my career happen. Yeah. And then when he gets the call that this other guy's been blinded, that's when he realizes this is real.
This is for real.
And I've done it and there's no looking back.
Yeah. Yeah.
And from then on, my favorite bit of this subtle dripping throughout is when Rosemary decides to throw a party for her old friends.
Oh my God, yeah. And
there's a shot in this sort of drinks nook where they've hired a bartender because Rosemary's too unwell to do all the hostessing herself.
And
my God.
And she's refusing to let the neighbours interfere with this, isn't she? Because at this point in the story, she's like, no.
And this is very modern. Good to set your boundaries.
Yes,
Everybody needs to set boundaries. But so they've hired this bartender. And there's this sort of absurd shot in the middle of everything where it's just the bartender talking to Guy. And he says, don't worry, sir. I'll give him a big drink now to get him going. And then I'll loosen it up. I'll lighten up as the night goes on to save it. And you can't figure out, like, why has this shot happened in the middle of all of this? And then you cut to the kitchen and you realize that the kitchen's right next to the drinks nook. And just in the corner of the frame, out of focus, you can see Guy listening in to Rosemary and her friends talking.
Yes.
And you realize Roman Polanski is the king of telling the story in front of you without you knowing it.
That is what's tremendous about it. It's like, it's like there's a mystery playing out, but there also isn't. They're showing it everything to you, and there's also this kind of dramatic irony to it, which means that even when you've seen it 10 times, you can still enjoy it on that other level where you're figuring out what is going on next door, what's going on in the periphery this whole time.
It so rewatches
clever.
Like a beautiful leftovers. It's like you just want to keep going back to it.
It's almost more frightening actually when you watch it again, because you're seeing how this gaslighting is being orchestrated bit by bit.
So this comes into how the audience perceives it.
Yeah.
And I think on the first watch, it's the most B movie it can be. The first time you watch it, I think it exists in the most B movie scenario where this woman's suddenly being raped by the devil and then her neighbors have given the baby On the rewatch, you begin to see how everyone is involved in it.
Yeah.
And in the rewatch, you begin to understand her paranoia more and more.
Yeah.
And in the rewatch, you begin to see how Polanski and his designers and everything has been really crystalline in every choice that was made through colors, through this, through that.
Just the setups, like why she's got the cabinet in front of the shelves.
Beautiful.
And all of those bits.
Show, don't tell.
It's wonderful. And it makes those moments, like the one you mentioned, the scene where she finally is like, I want my own friends to come over. And it's like, it makes that moment all the more painful and upsetting because you're like, oh, your friends are right there. They're offering you help. And it's like, and still she falls into this trap.
Well,
you know?
And this does bring me to my only problematic bit of the film, which is the bit with the other doctors and her being in pain. Like, there's a little bit in the middle of the pregnancy where it doesn't quite all add up.
Right, yeah. But there is a real sting in the tale, and this is what I kind of love about it, in that she has to give up her other the doctor she likes in favour of Dr. Abe, whatever his name is, the one that they recommend. And he's obviously a Satanist, so he's orchestrating this whole thing. He's obviously a Satanist, so he's giving her all of these drugs that she needs for whatever, and he's part of it. But then she starts to like sort of clock on, doesn't she? And in the final act of the film, she's like, no, I'm going to go see Dr. Hill, my doctor. And there is, again, this moment when you think, oh, please, thank God, he believes her. And then, of course, he doesn't. And actually, that is the moment when you go, oh, my God, like, Satanism aside,
chauvinism is balls.
Yeah, it's still this horrible story about this woman who no one believes and this man that completely dismisses her. And that's not even a supernatural horror moment. That is just pure real life horror.
And this is why I kind of think, like, we get the baby's conceived. It's very clear, very conceived on the 4th or 5th of October. Going to be born on like the 27th, 28th, 29th of July, I think.
Yes.
Gets born early. But then we see New Year's party, we see the friends come over after that, but then there is this sort of second trimester that goes like the wind.
That's true.
And I do wonder, this to me, because I was thinking about the fact that, so the writer of the book, who...
Ira Levin, yeah.
So good, Ira Levin. Yeah. And he also went on to write Stepford Wives after this. And so he obviously has a whole theme around domesticity and what the ideal wife is and all this kind of stuff. But when you've got all of these men involved in the screenwriting and this and that, I'm not surprised they skipped out the second trimester. Like, it feels a little bit like, oh, this goes on for, even Rosemary says it seems so long away. Yeah. And her doctor goes, it is.
Yeah.
And I think in the male psyche, it's like, oh, let's get through this. It's going on too long, so it's boring, so let's get through this. So they jump a bit ahead. And I think there is an element of that this film does miss. It doesn't really have... As much as it is a film about a female protagonist going through pregnancy and this, that, and the other, I don't think it's from the female perspective.
That's interesting. That's what I was going to ask you, because obviously this is such a female. This is such a female-centric story, obviously made by a bunch of dudes: Roman Polanski, Ira Levin, whoever else. So yeah, do you
bunch of dudes?
Yeah. Do you see? So do you see that when you watch the film? Can you tell?
I definitely see a cultural definition of female fragility when I watch this film.
Yeah.
And I think that's part of what makes it so much more frightening to me. This idea that, I mean, not being funny, watching it with my big girl pants on, it's like she's really weak.
Yeah,
why doesn't she go out? Why doesn't she have friends? Why doesn't she leave the house literally ever? Why is she so controlled by her husband?
Yeah.
So that is frustrating, but I think Mia Farrow pulls it off in a way that it's truthful and it's her character rather than her character fighting against the structure of society. We believe it as the essence. But it is definitely a male version of a woman in peril.
That's interesting. Yeah.
And I think there's an aspect of, you go back to a film like we were discussing earlier, Wait Until Dark.
Yeah.
And that's a much more full independent, she's an independent blind woman living on her own.
Yeah.
And you get a lot more of that self-sufficiency from her character than you do from Mia Farrow.
Yeah, Rosemary as a character, although she shows signs of kind of strength in the second half, there's a lot of it where you're going, oh, come on, like, please just tell him to fuck off, There are moments when she just is so passive.
I think she has to be infantilized, though. Like, as in, I think they chose to infantilize her. You look at the giant bibs on her dresses, like all of her dresses.
Totally, you're right.
And even the Mary Jane like patent leather flats, which are the sort of child's uniform shoes and this kind of stuff, and her haircut, her little pixie haircut.
Yes.
Like all of it really infantilizes her physically.
Totally.
She's not a tall woman, but she's not a tiny woman. She's just very thin. And these dresses really are baby doll dresses, which change her shape to be very infantilized.
They are. I mean, it's both very fitting for the period, for the late 1960s, but also it's perfect for that kind of, it really, you're so right, it infantilizes her. And weirdly, it's not at all, again, the idea that Roman Polanski wanted this quote-unquote milk-fed, or whatever it was he used.
Exactly,
It's quite interesting now, because you can't imagine, I mean, it feels so deliberate in some ways. That
it would have been so much more
looks,
Castle.
Yes.
It would have been a much more William Castle picture.
Yes.
It could have even been a Hammer horror picture if Rosemary had been this sort of busty blonde coming in going, my baby, I hear them crying next door.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. But you're right. I think all of these elements to it make it more frightening, which ultimately it's a horror film, right?
Well, it's meant to be frightening, yeah.
It sneaks up on you as a horror film, though, I think, doesn't it? Because really, how much horror is there? I mean, like, until the last 15 minutes, maybe. What's really interesting.
Dude, though, that suicide is so much bigger than I remembered it being.
Yeah.
Like, that suicide is, like, for real.
Oh, my God.
Talk about, like, whoa, woman jumps out of a window, and we see her, like, half her head covered in blood and just viscera.
And so she's the character, Terry, who I think was originally set up to be the first
narratively, exactly. Yeah, she was definitely their first shot at...
I mean, actually, one of the things going back to this idea of this kind of B story going on that you notice second time round, we need to talk about how brilliant the dream sequences are, because I think he nails dream sequences, Polanski, in this movie. And oh my God, the first one, this is before even the rape, but after the suicide happens, and she's dreaming about the nuns on the boat. And it's that thing where you're hearing stuff going on in the real world and it's seeping into your dreams, and you can hear the muffled voice of Minnie and Roman talking about how, we knew she's ruined it, blah, blah, blah. Basically talking about how the fact that this woman's committed suicide and ruined their plans. And it's kind of seeping into this dream in a kind of
her own anxieties about
way.
her childhood traumas as well. Like, it's become the dialogue of her childhood trauma instead of the moment she's living at the time.
Exactly. And it works on two levels, where it's like, also, they are just genuinely having a conversation on the other side of that wall about how, this woman's offed herself and now they need to find a new mother of the devil. But yeah, there is also all this other stuff going on in her head, and it's so clever that you get on rewatch,
Maybe we wouldn't have had to do this. We'd have been all set to go now instead of having to start all over from scratch. I told you not to tell her in advance. I told you she wouldn't be open-minded.
I told Sister Veronica about the windows, and she withdrew the school from the competition.
Well, and the staging as well. They have one of those brilliant shots where I'm sure anyone who's been to well-staged theater will have seen those backdrops where you turn on the lights and the wall becomes solid.
Yeah.
And the wall behind her bed is this monastery behind her.
Yes.
And then she sort of begins to wake up and the light comes on and the wall becomes solid again.
Oh,
and it's
so good.
There's a lot of in-camera. You know what? There was a couple of like freaky effects in here, as in sort of Evans, when he talks about it, makes a big point of saying, this wasn't, William Castle wasn't doing his usual tricks in this. It's like, no, there's definitely smoke. There's definitely smoke happening.
Oh, definitely, yeah.
And there's the one bit where she starts to kind of fade out during the intro to the rape scene, and it's got like some green smoke going on it as visuals.
Well, that's so interesting, isn't it? The producer-director thing, because the dream sequences are in some ways the parts that reminded me most of Repulsion. This idea of like inside this woman's psyche, and there are these kind of extreme close-ups on Mia Farrow's face. Everything is a bit kind of dreamlike and off. But yeah, you're right. At the same time, you've got William Castle's smoke, and you've got that weird devilish kind of claw and the bloods and the naked people.
We wouldn't give that any time of day now.
Yeah,
like you would not. It's kind of, again, we talk about The Exorcist in a couple of weeks, going back in time.
Yes.
But it's the same kind of thing where some of this stuff just really wouldn't fly anymore.
Yeah.
But it still does because of what's surrounding it really holds water.
And it's really bold that, again, it's like in the first act of the movie, they're telling you everything you need to know. You've literally got all of the neighbours stood around with Guy, and they're talking about what they're doing to her as she's being raped. Like, they're kind of handing it to you on a plate. Like, in some ways, there's no mystery to it. They are showing you what's really happening. But at the same time, you're kind of like, what is this? What's going on?
And you know what? I love it because, we have that chocolate mousse scene where Guy's with they're meant to be shagging tonight. And for the first time in the entire movie, Mia Farrow is wearing red instead of white or yellow. And at first it looks like a sort of like dressing gown robe thing, but then you realize it's a sailor suit, which is again infantilizing her.
Yeah.
And Guy goes, they're sitting down to this candlelit dinner, and Guy goes to answer the door, and it's Millie, of course it is, but Minnie, but of course she's brought them chocolate mousse.
Yeah.
But like the biggest chocolate mousse you've ever seen in your entire life.
Clearly drugged.
Yeah, like very,
well.
And we know it's drugged instantly, and from there, we know this to be true.
Yes, yeah.
There is no denial of this truth from here on.
That's it, and we're watching this horrific, inevitable thing happen. Yeah.
This is no dream. This is really happening.
It's really horrible. And I think, you've got these Satanists next door, and yet I think Guy Woodhouse might be one of the most despicable evil characters in all of cinema.
He's so bloody wet. He's just he's
awful in every way.
I only do these motorcycle commercials, and my life is so hard. I live in a massive house which I can afford, but my life is so hard. Fuck off, Guy.
He's so awful in every conceivable way.
Quote of the film for Guy. Just think of it like you had a miscarriage, and then it's fine, right? Like, it's,
Don't worry about it.
But we get all I think he literally says something like, paraphrase, but he says, think of it like you've just had a miscarriage, but instead we get all this stuff.
Exactly. Instead, I get all these great acting gigs. I know. It's true horror. Yeah, the way he plays it, and those little microaggressions and passive aggressions, and the way that he will kind of sulk, and then but he's done something heinous to her, and then he'll sulk, and then she'll apologize to him. This is stuff
which is pure gaslighting.
It's pure gaslighting. It's so interesting, and it's stuff that I think, for a 1968 movie is incredible. I think it's so ahead of its time in that way. This is stuff that we were praising Midsommar for earlier this year. This kind of like microaggressions between a boyfriend and girlfriend in a film, and it's all there in Rosemary's Baby as well.
Well, and seeing just. I think that, so, we talk about how does this film play in modernity, right? Mm-hmm. I think it super holds up because this is still an iconography that makes a lot of sense. They don't hold on the effects. So while they're a bit hokey, it plays like something like The Devils or Blood on Satan's Claw, where it just feels of the time and you're willing to accept it, and it just moves on. Yeah. And the rest of the film's so beautiful, you can't really blame it. But I think when you look at the dynamic from a modern perspective, it has actually become even more in focus. So let's talk about this rape scene in particular. Let's talk about the morning after.
We need to talk about this whole thing, because it is, like you said, like you set up, it's supposed to be the night they're going to shag because they're trying for a baby and she's ovulating or whatever. So they're like,
she's ovulating,
She's ovulating. She's marked it on the calendar. She's wearing red.
Her biological clock is ticking like this.
Oh, and there is actually a ticking through the dream sequence,
it's true.
isn't there?
That's her
there is a
biological
ticking.
Clock. from Marissa Tomei.
But of course, he drugs her or Minnie drugs her with the mousse, and she passes out. And then you get this incredibly, like we talked about, this weird mix of art house versus William Castle schlock.
It's so bonkers.
Incredible, absolutely incredible. I love that those dream sequences are kind of muted as well. There's no music, at least for the bulk of it, until the end, you know?
Well, and I think, there's the ticking clock, like you said, that creates this sort of tension. And it does really almost feel like Polanski's been told he needs to direct a Doctor Who episode. And he's just like, is this what this looks like? I guess this is what William Castle's stuff looks like.
But it's so clever because it's also, you can feel it's this European art director as well, you know? It's like,
so brilliant.
It's
It kind of, it makes me wish that he'd done Plan 9 from outer space or something. Like,
Tell me you have been bitten by a mouse.
Yes. That's why I couldn't come to see you.
Oh, that's all right. We wouldn't want you to jeopardize your health.
Am I forgiven, Father?
Oh, absolutely.
But yes, then the morning after, exactly.
So I found this interesting from two sides, which is that, for one, she says she's very calm about it. She sees the scratches on her body, and he says, "Oh, I didn't want to give it up." And what he means is, what he's saying in that instance is, I didn't want to miss the window for your ovulation.
Just because you were too drunk
to have sex. And her response is, "Oh, but it could have been okay this morning or later today. It wasn't that quick, the window." And then he says, "Oh, I was a bit drunk too."
Yes.
And so there's two sides of this. One, there's the discussion that it happened, that it exists. Now, clearly, we as the audience in 1968 or whenever it was, or now, we are meant to feel uncomfortable and like this was a trespass regardless.
Yes, this was a violation, basically.
Exactly. So that's the very modern version of
Yes.
it. I think what is probably didn't exist then but does exist now for an audience is the notion that while it was wrong then, now it is illegal.
Yes, marital rape was legal in 1968.
And this is the thing.
Yeah.
I think the difference between an audience watching that then and now is that this is now an illegal act we're talking about. And so it villainizes the husband much earlier in the film.
Of course, the irony is he didn't have sex with her. The devil did. So she was actually raped by an outside party, but he's taking the credit for it and taking ownership of it. But he didn't actually even do it. But anyway, it's wrong on all kinds of levels.
He is such a prick.
Yeah.
Oh my God. He is like the worst kind of business partner.
Yeah.
Like, he's the worst.
But that historical context makes it all the more disturbing that you're right. That was his excuse because that was legal then.
It was fine. It wasn't considered a problem.
I didn't want to miss baby night.
You...
And a couple of my nails were ragged, and it was kind of fun in a necrophile sort of way.
I dreamed someone was raping me. I don't know, someone inhuman.
Thanks a lot.
But now, obviously, and I think this is, funnily enough, I think this is how the film has aged, is that now we quite quickly see Guy as a villain.
As a monster, yeah, you're right. It gives up any kind of mystery.
Exactly. Yeah. Whereas I think at the time, the notion of this bossy husband, the notion of this controlling husband was not quite so alien to culture. Whereas now we very clearly see that as a monster, and we very clearly see that as a villain. And, there's this, they try and pull it back with this whole, he's been cold because he's been working on this play.
Yes.
But that's just not enough for current emotional standards.
No, totally.
So that's the only bit I think that ages poorly. But
it kind of...
I think it elevates it.
Exactly. It ages poorly, but it actually...
elevates it.
yeah, it does. It gives it a whole other level of horror. That's the thing. It's going back to the idea of the doctor not believing her at the end and all these other moments where, regardless of the satanic whatever, it's just men treating her like shit from beginning to end, And there's that and that has aged very well. That element.
Unfortunately.
Yes.
Super current.
Yeah,
that
exactly. And you're right. That at the time, I'm sure that is part of the mystery as to what is Guy's intentions, because horror, we talked about this a lot, but in the 1960s horror changed, didn't it? And we'd had things like Psycho in 1960, but until then the monster didn't look like this good-looking guy next door in the way that John Cassavetes and these other characters do, you know? Yeah. So it was still quite a new thing.
Can I just say, I love Minnie's makeup throughout the film.
We haven't even talked about Ruth, what's her name, who plays Minnie? She won an Oscar. We need to talk about those two.
Polanski got all these characters by drawing pictures of what he thought they would look like, and then saying he wanted old-timey actors to be in it.
Yes.
And he sent that to the casting department at Paramount, and he said, bring me whoever looks like this and is old-timey.
And we got Ruth Gordon. Ruth Gordon.
Oh my God. Can I just say Harold and Maude? Like, I do not cry harder than when I watch Harold and Maude.
Incredible movie. Incredible. But yeah, Ruth Gordon won a Best Supporting Actress Oscar for this.
She's wicked. She's fucking brilliant.
It's so funny, though, to think that performance in this movie, this William Castle movie, won an Oscar. It's amazing,
I love her bloody eyeshadow. Like, her bright blue, garish eyeshadow, and her, like, this idea of this mask of femininity and these really bright clothing and, like...
And this kind of, like...
Garish.
This kind of neurotic busybody next door who's interfering. And
you excuse it because of the nosy neighbor trope without going, but it's this witch stealing information.
And that is what's brilliant, again, is that classic. It's the thing that horror does best, because like we've talked about throughout this whole film, is that it works on two levels. She is this monstrous next door neighbor who is this kind of classic kind of interfering neighbor that we've all met and kind of have experienced. But
it's like social neuroses, isn't it?
But it's also, she's also actually evil.
Well, and this is this is something, and I feel like this started very much with the British traditions, and that this is a film where you can see it kind of evolve into this Americanized Hollywood version of it, but where you just accept this boundary crossing out of cultural politeness, and that initial acceptance through politeness finds you getting deeper and deeper into the dark side. And eventually crossing over into, you know, the Woody Harrelson version of letting your wife sleep with Robert Redford for the night.
Right.
Except it's the devil and you're getting an acting career.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, you're so right. And actually, you know, Minnie might be the kind of smartest character in the whole film, really. She's kind of orchestrating everything. As much as she seems like this kind of like all over the place bumbling woman who keeps coming over, every visit with every gift is again, it's part of something bigger.
Well, and this is why the rewatches, I think, are so important. And it's a film that gives you these little gifts every time you watch it again, where you go, oh, that was when that was revealed, and it did make sense, and it did have an explanation. There's a little treat, so something I'd never noticed before this watch, and it's kind of big, so I'm a bit embarrassed to say it, but is when they first go into the house to look around. Yeah. There's a little note, and it says, I must resign, or I can no longer participate. I can no longer be a member.
Oh, I've not seen that.
Oh my God. So the implication is the woman who lived there before was another member of the coven, but she couldn't deal with it anymore, and so they offed her.
Yeah.
So, but this is what I mean, is there's all these little, gorgeous little succulent tidbits throughout the production.
And the sound design. I mean, there's a moment when Hutch, who is like one of her friends, like a person that's on her side, Hutch is the previous, I think, landlord of the place they lived at before.
I think they used to live in his flat.
Who kind of is there at the beginning and kind of warns them, like, a lot of weird shit's happened in this apartment block over the years.
Well, he's the person who's like he's the link of the lifeline that gets severed, isn't he?
Yes, he's the kind of harbinger at the beginning that kind of sets up this like, oh, this might not be right. And then, of course, there's this moment when they're going to meet, and I think he's going to tell her what really is going on. He's figured it out because he's read up a lot on Satanism and witchcraft and all this stuff.
But he has to do it tomorrow.
Oh, and then of course there's that moment when Guy just goes, oh, who are you meeting? Oh, Hutch. Oh, what time and where? And she says, 11 o'clock at the Time Building.
Like, I guess I need to go get some ice cream.
Yes, and then he walks out, and then you hear very distantly the doorbell.
What was that?
He wants to talk to me.
What about?
I don't know. He wouldn't say.
I think those boys' adventure stories are going to his head. Where are you meeting him?
Time and Life Building tomorrow at 11 o'clock.
This is ridiculous. You're pregnant. I've got the ends. I'm going to get an ice cream cone. You want one?
Yeah, I'd love one.
Vanilla?
Okay.
Okay.
And he's immediately going over to Minnie and Roman's, and then it cuts straight to the next day, and Rosemary is ringing the doorbell going,
Hi.
as she tells her, "Oh, I'm going out, so don't bother giving me my shake." And it's like those little sound design moments.
So good.
It's
and the thing is, it's just like every level of this film was well collaborated on.
Yeah.
People were communicating. People
Yeah.
were talking about and really genuinely creating a full vision that they worked on together.
Yes.
And it pays off in a way that's such a treat for the audience.
Yeah, I love it. It's just this idea, and the best films have this idea that, like, just outside of the frame, it doesn't end. Like, there's still stuff going on. There's still a world there on this film, you know? It's
absolutely.
Oh god, it's so good.
Well, and it keeps you, you know, I often find some of the frustrating moments. I'm going to do one of my like name dropping nonsense things,
Please do.
but so I studied film criticism under this guy named Andrew Saris, who's spectacular and very dead now, but was lovely. And he used to be the head film critic for The Village Voice, and very famously like spearheaded auteur theory for the Cahiers de Cinema and all this nonsense.
Wow.
But one of the things he always focused on when talking about this film was the notion of how much the audience has to bring to it.
Yes.
And how much the attention of the audience has to be worth the work of the artist in order for the fullness of the film to be accepted.
Yeah.
And in a way, I really feel like this is a film I don't know if I could name another film that you have to watch more than once to fully appreciate.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, because I do think, like you mentioned, it can come across as maybe a bit of a campy B movie when you first watch it. It can, of course it can, especially if you don't know what's coming and the ending is all of these old people going, "Hail Satan" and stuff. And it is
Naked.
yeah, exactly. It kind of is the sort of thing that now we would see in a comedy, you know? So it is, you have to go back and go, "Oh, wait a minute, this is really horrible what's happening to this woman from beginning to end," you know?
Absolutely. I want to give props as well to that one, and I can't remember the actress's name or even the character's name, but the supporting neighbor who's the slightly heavier set woman
With the big glasses.
with the big glasses, who is sort of just like this bumbling neighbor in the beginning, and then in the final scene when like it's very clearly Satan's offspring in this black mass baby bassinet.
Yeah.
She's like, hiss. And then I think she sticks her tongue out at Mia Farrow.
Right. Well,
And I love this depiction of these juvenile devil worshippers, these juvenile Satanists who are just like, boo, boo. And it suddenly becomes very pantomime.
Totally. And this is, I mean, we touched upon this at the beginning, but how do you think that tonal balance is handled? He pulls it off, I guess, Polanski, but this mix of the true camp silliness, you know, that like moments like that when you've got a Satanist sticking her tongue out at Rosemary, and then all the other stuff we've discussed, you know?
I really, honestly, he and I did end up reading the script as a result of coming on for this, but he really transitions quite slowly.
Yes.
And nothing is ever out of the blue. And the dreams transition from reality, transition to reality. The surreal transitions, like it's just on a measure, it's on a beat. It's giving you a taste before it gives you the full flavor.
Yeah.
And I think it is that element of artistry that means you're never overwhelmed by this absurdity. Like it feels unsettling, but never outside possibility.
Yeah, totally. It's so interesting. And, you know, I think like we've talked about, you know, whether or not occult movies still stand up in terms of, do they still scare us? Because are we still scared of the devil as a concept, you know? There's a moment in this film where she reads the real Time magazine cover that says, "Is God dead?"
Is
right?
God dead?
Which was a real thing from 1966, where you know, people were genuinely concerned that like science is basically killing religion. It was a worry for people in the 1960s.
Well, and
right?
I think like if you go into the world of Catholicism and this kind of thing, and you know, obviously they talk a lot about the Pope in this, and there's a depiction of the Pope, and Mia Farrow's Catholic, and Roman Polanski came from
very Catholic Poland,
very Catholic Poland background culturally. And so there's a lot of that, and you think about as well. So I don't know this for a fact, but I think the guy she's talking about Catholicism on the boat with is meant to be JFK. There's that bit over the shoulder where she's talking to an Irish American sounding guy from New York, or you know, he's got the kind of Kennedy accent.
Yeah,
and it's just this bit of his face, and they're talking about Catholicism and politics and this kind of stuff. So there's definitely an undertone of that kind of thing across the film, and without being too nihilistic about it, religion's always been a way to control the masses and morality tales and this kind of thing. And I think just like you guys had over here with the video nasties, I think there was a fear that if people broke away from religion, then they were going to break away from political control as well.
Yes.
And so I think it was actually less a morality issue, because there's nothing particularly morally, confounding about the depiction of the devil in this film.
No.
There's no point at which he's depicted as like a pretty cool dude.
No. He's literally monstrous. Yeah.
Exactly. So I don't think there's any issues with that. I think it was more the issue of saying, poking fun at religion.
Yeah.
And using it as a scare tactic and making it pointedly a scare tactic so that people started to take it less seriously. I think that was more the concern than actually our children summoning the devil. Because like, not being funny, I've seen a lot of those headlines.
Yes.
And not once has it actually happened.
No.
So.
Exactly. And we've talked about this already on this series, but this idea that you're absolutely right, this idea that like it's basically a lot of the time state worrying that they're losing control, and it's that church and state thing. And horror movies have been connected with Satanism. Metal music has been connected. Dungeons and Dragons, the game, was at one point connected with Satanism. Anything about in some way being an outsider has been connected with Satanism. And of course, in the 60s, it was the hippie movement, and it was counterculture, and it was all of that, and it was sexual liberation. And of course, it's exactly what you said. It's state or people of power worrying that they're losing control, isn't it? If
I haven't told the story about when I had a location torn out from underneath me because a Google search apparently had informed the location owner that I was a Satanist and a pornographer. I never felt more loved I never felt like I was finally part of the horror world more than when I literally got thrown off someone's property for being a Satanist and a pornographer.
What? Why does somebody think you're a Satanist and a pornographer? Or are you?
No, I mean, not that there's anything wrong with that.
No, exactly.
No, I did a work on a show with James Gunn called PG Porn, which is like, not being funny, Guardians of the Galaxy's James Gunn. And that's, it's like super illegitimate, but it was called PG Porn, and it had porn actresses, but also famous comedians.
Right.
And it was poking fun at the standard of porn. But like the other thing was the devil worship was a press photo that I'd done in Fangoria. And it was me and director Sean Hogan and one of our financiers, Jay Slater, stood around a pentagram with a fake baby in the middle of it. And in retrospect, possibly it was in poor taste, but at the time, it seemed perfectly reasonable. But yeah, so
and it's so interesting because, like you said, Roman Polanski was Catholic, Mia Farrow was Catholic. I don't know about R11, but look at The Exorcist, which we're going to be talking about. William Peter Blatty was a Catholic, and these movies are actually made by God and devil-fearing people, and I wonder if that adds to it.
I think you have to be to make these films. Yeah. Like I'm a God-chilling Methodist lapsed, so like I'm agnostic as they come, but pretty chill about the whole God sitch.
Yeah,
I think you have to go into Catholicism for somebody to really fear God.
Yeah, totally.
And it's funnily enough, though, we have. Like the Old Testament is the scarier one, and we don't have a lot of really good films from that perspective necessarily.
No, totally. Yeah, you're right.
But for some reason, Catholicism freaks the shit out of people and ends up making them make scary movies about God.
It's so interesting, isn't it? It's so interesting. But ultimately, what it comes down to with Rosemary's Baby and The Exorcist, and The Omen, I suppose, as well, is this idea that actually Catholics are the good guys, priests are the good guys, the devil is the bad guy. So
just remember.
Yeah, exactly. They're the heroes. They were the Avengers of the time, these priests.
The idea of Catholic priests as the Avengers of the 1965, like in a sort of Hellboy maybe scenario.
Yeah, exactly. Like Father Karras in The Exorcist is the Captain America of his day. Right?
I love it. It's the power of Christ compels you to smash.
Exactly.
It's sort of
exactly. Yeah. So finally, then, we've touched upon it briefly, but the ending of Rosemary's Baby, we should talk about when it goes full horror, when she discovers what's going on in the flat next door, because she's told, isn't she? She has the baby. She's told that it's dead, and but they're still expressing her milk, and they're still then kind of like acting shifty, especially the woman with the big glasses is acting shifty around her.
Shifty.
Yeah.
Shifty
and
McQueen.
She hears the baby crying next door, and then she goes to the next door's flat, and we don't see the baby. All we see is her look of horror when she sees it, and then she says, "What have you done to its eyes?"
Which is a brilliant, like, Jaws-esque moment. Don't show the shark. Like, you know, let us think of what this looks like. Don't show us, because it would have been hokey. There's nothing they could have shown us that would have been as captivating as her response to what we saw.
Totally.
What have you done to it? What have you done to its eyes?
He has his father's eyes.
I think the baby crying is brilliant. I think that's one of the aspects that really touches with female psyche as well, is like this fear of the baby crying, and you know, without going too far into it, our domestic animals learn how to sound like babies crying to just fuck with us. Like cats learn the cat's meow is tuned to the same frequency as a baby crying. If you've ever heard my dog moan, you know this to be true, but certainly they can do this as well.
Yeah, that's so interesting.
But it's because this sound messes with the human psyche. It's a sound of urgency and a sound of emergency as well. And
that's evolution, isn't it? I mean, that's why we're here.
Absolutely. Baby cry, danger, emergency, do something.
Yeah.
And so that's brilliant sound design there as well. And then obviously, like, gaslighting on gaslighting on gaslighting. Your baby's dead. No, you're not hearing anything. And then this quite, you know, parochial moment of just stumbling into cocktail hour. She brought the knife. Not sure what she planned to do with the knife, but she brought the knife.
It's so matter of fact. And that's the funny thing about all of the scenes of horror in this film, is that they're very matter of fact. It's kind of like, oh yeah, there's the woman with her head smashed on the pavement who jumped out of the building. Oh yeah, you're getting raped by the devil. It's just kind of very like, and when she walks into that apartment and they're all just stood around, and it's just kind of like, yep, here it is.
It's a bit inevitable,
what you thought it was.
Isn't it?
Yes.
It's a bit inevitable.
It's inevitable, exactly.
Like it's sort of like she's on this track.
Yes.
That she, no matter what she does, she can struggle as much as she wants, but she's never going to get off it.
Yes,
and
she's heading straight
just
for
inevitable.
It. Basically, everything pretty much happened as they designed it to, from beginning to end, and that is all we see, isn't it? Is her on this journey.
Absolutely,
it's really, you know, scary,
and that's terrifying as a human being. And it's about free will, and you know, can we get out, and this, that, and the other, and we're left with this thought that either she has to agree to raise the baby, agree to forget the baby, or be killed.
Yes.
And yet, this may be a fairly modern interpretation. When you hear Polanski talk about it, he very specifically states that he wanted it to have a ambiguous ending. I don't think the ending's ambiguous in the slightest. I think it's very clear. As far as, is this the devil or not?
Yes.
I think it's very obvious it's the devil.
Very.
I think it's very clear it's supernatural, this kind of stuff. But what I do think is ambiguous is whether or not Rosemary plans to kill him or not.
Yes.
I do think, and I think that's something that's come with modernity. I don't think that's something that necessarily the audiences felt then, but maybe us with our perspectives now.
Yes.
We can get more of a sense of, is she planning to actually kill this kid the second they give her the chance?
Yeah, because I guess probably at the time, and I guess what you're designed to think is that she's succumbed to it and she's going to look after this baby, even though it's the devil's
exactly.
child.
I think that's the intent.
Maternal kind of instinct has taken over, and she loves it anyway. Kind
exactly.
Of thing. Yeah. Whereas I think Guy has other ideas. He's like, right, we've done this now. Can we fuck off to LA so I can be famous?
Oh my god, he's such a douchebag. He's the worst. Oh my god.
He's so bad because he's not even overtly upfront about the fact that he's evil. I think that's what it is. There's something almost forgivable about all of the old people who are like, yeah, we did it. Yeah. He's like, but it'll be okay, right? You can see why I did it, you know.
You promised me you wouldn't be hurt. And you haven't been, really. I mean, supposing you had the baby and you lost it, wouldn't that be the same? We're getting so much in return, Ro.
He's like, oh, well, no, but I did a transaction. And you know what the thing is that he actually didn't give anything.
Yeah.
He never gave... And okay, exactly. So I hadn't actually thought about this, so I'll step on it for a second. But Guy doesn't give anything other than sex with his wife.
Exactly.
And that's not his to give.
Exactly. And he sacrifices nothing.
Exactly. Yeah. And I think that's what sticks in our craw about this as it develops, is that the idea of her as a possession, the idea of her as an object, he gave nothing.
Yes.
He's the one who made the agreement without having actually had any authority to do so.
Yeah.
And that's why he's a fucker.
Yeah.
Like, that's why he is the absolute worst. Like,
he's what people would now call the ultimate kind of toxic male, isn't he?
oh my God.
You know, that's what he is.
And I love him sort of like limping around the flat, trying to pretend like to get this character who walks on crutches who he has to play. And it's so difficult.
Yeah.
How does someone pretend to walk on crutches? I don't know. I got shagged by the devil. Leave me alone.
I know.
I don't have time for your nonsense, guy.
I know. Oh man, it's truly a horrific film, I think, no matter what angle you come at it from, and that's why it's so good, right? That's why it's incredible.
True. Here's a weird question. What does Rosemary do?
What happens next?
No. Professionally.
Oh, well, I assume she didn't. I assume
But ever? Like, did she not go to it? Like, she's got no backstory at all, does she? She just is Guy's wife.
That is very true.
He's an actor. He's this. They have friends.
We don't know anything about her other than that she is wife and mother.
Exactly. She's got no parents. We know that she used to live in this other flat.
Yeah.
There's nothing. There's no definition of Rosemary outside the context of this movie. And
that's really scary.
I found that. Well, see, isn't that strange as well? And again, I think that's a little bit one of the things about this being from a male perspective. Is that if there's not. This movie doesn't overwhelmingly suffer from being from a male perspective at all. It's Roman Polanski's done a very good job with it for the most part. But this is one of those elements that I think we find lacking. Is that. What, did she go to finishing school? Did she try and be something and fail? Like for a bit, she might be an actress for a little bit, but it's, and you know what? I feel like maybe the book would have given us more of this, but I don't have that knowledge.
No,
so if somebody has it, please shout at me with what her background is, because I think that would be very interesting to know as well.
That's so interesting, because all we know is, she looks after the apartment. She's very trendy. She's very fashionable, and she wants to be a mother, and she wants to please Guy. And there's those moments where she gets so excited when she sees him on the TV and goes right up to the TV, and he is
very
her world, basically,
right?
isn't he? Yeah. And that is it. Oh God, it's so scary. It's disturbing in all kinds of ways.
It's horrifying in so many ways. Yeah.
It's so interesting. And actually, what I was going to ask you is, do you see this as a feminist movie in any way?
No. And the thing is, like, and I think this is something that people need to be straightforward about, is that there is a difference between something being about women and being feminist.
Exactly, yeah.
And I'm working on a project now, and one of the bits of feedback I got was that if it became too feminist, it would put off certain audiences.
No way.
Well, no, but and you know what? I defend what they're saying in a bit. Like if it got like feminazi and it became messagey, then I can see, because that's not what we're trying to do with the story anyway. That's not the point of the story.
And also there's a difference as well, isn't there, between a film being not misogynist and being
and this is what I mean,
and feminist,
and so my retort to them was that there's just as many bitches as there are bastards in the film. So it's sort of it's you can have a femalist film without it being a feminist film, or a woman driven film without it being a feminist film. I don't think there's anything feminist about this. Like there's another woman who's a dope addict before her, who's going to be the woman before her. You've got
other old woman.
Yeah, you've got Minnie and all that lot who are absolute horrible old witches.
Yeah.
Yes, you've got her maybe clutch of 4 friends who are there supporting her for like a minute and a half of the film. But it's not as though women are put on a pedestal in this film. It's just a film that is, it's written and directed by men, and presenting, something that could be described as female hysteria, but is in fact a realistic experience.
Yes.
In a way that is terrifying.
Yes.
But no, I wouldn't say it's feminist.
Yeah,
it's excellent badass female character, but no, feminist not so much. Yeah.
And do you still stand by it, having rewatched it? Do you still stand by it being pretty much your favorite movie?
I really do, because it's, again, and I think a lot of that is the joy of the layers. And I think the repetitive joy it gives me every time I watch it. And you know what? Yes, the director's an asshole, but I don't think that deletes all of the work that Farrow, that Cassavetes, that Silver, that the writer, that all these other people did on the film. I don't think you can say their work is pointless just because he's a prick.
Yeah. Do you think it's in any way, not to keep going back to this topic, but the fact that the film is about gaslighting, rape, abuse, does that make it harder to watch knowing that the director is a rapist, like it's like that thing where if you watch a Woody Allen film and most of them are about him in relationships with young women and him on screen as well, it adds that extra layer of like, oh, it's even trickier to watch,
I think because the scenario around Polanski's crimes is a little bit more cut and dry than anything that was gaslighting.
Yeah, that's very true. Yeah.
I think it makes it easier. I think what doesn't make it any easier is accommodating the idea that you like someone's work who you also hate the individual. And I think, that's okay. It's okay to hate the individual and like their work. People say, well, how do you bring the two of those things together? You don't.
Yeah.
You don't have to accommodate the two ideas. They can be a prick and you can like their work.
And I think it's this idea of it's the director more than anyone, isn't it? And it's this idea, and I'm probably guilty of this myself, but we all put directors on the pedestal. I'm sure if the second AD or the cinematographer was a rapist, no one would even acknowledge it.
Well, there's a lot of that about as well.
Exactly.
That pops up from time to time.
Of course there is, exactly. And yet it's different when it's the director in some way, isn't it?
And this comes into auteur theory, and that's probably a longer conversation, but also I'm not always super, and obviously I'm a producer and I've done some directing, but I'm not super keen on auteur theory because even on a small film, there's 30 people who made it.
Exactly. And like you've talked about, look at all the work that Mia Farrow's put into this, to John Cassavetes, to Ruth, Gordon, and all of these amazing people as well.
It's incredible. Well, and even when you look at the script, and even though Polanski wrote the screenplay, he says himself it was virtually a transcription of the book. And the text material is always such a vital piece of any film. Like it is, if that doesn't work, then the film's never going to work. It's incredible. So, are there auteurs? Yes, some people are. Is every director an auteur? Absolutely not. Could we do with just getting rid of that entirely? Probably. Just because I've met incredible creatives who aren't directors, and you would never know who they are because they're not directors. Not but individuals, the average Joe, etc. And yet directors would never be where they were without them.
Well, there's something to be said, I think, for how good it is to be a director for hire that can jump in on any project, no matter what it is, if it doesn't suit their auteur style, and still direct the shit out of something, right? I mean, that's nothing to be sort of sniffed at as well.
Absolutely not. No, that's a grafter, man.
Yeah.
And it's not to say that those individuals can't go off and do their own thing as well, but no, it's there's so many more grafters in this industry than I think the audience realizes.
Totally.
There's so many more people who are working their butts off day to day to do their job and tell a story. And then several people who, through marketing campaigns and graders and editors, are given a look that isn't even their look, that just happens to be what the studio slaps on whatever they're doing. That, it's not so far between the grafters and the so-called auteurs. I think audiences would do to look up their favorite small screen directors and figure out what kind of work they like from them as well.
And for people that are umming and ahhing, who have never seen Rosemary's Baby,
oh my days,
you would still recommend it.
Absolutely.
I mean,
even if we've spoiled the hell out of it, and you're here going, well, what else is there left to learn? There's my days.
It's one of the all-timers, isn't it? It is. And what happened in 1968? Because it's like Witchfinder General, Rosemary's Baby, and Night of the Living Dead all in that same year. What a year for horror, American horror, particularly.
Well, and I think a lot of that, because these are actually films that were financed. These are studio films. I think a lot of it was that the studios found themselves on the brink of being willing to take the risk.
Yeah.
And then once those films broke, it made it much easier for films like The Exorcist and all this kind of thing
all the stuff that comes
to
after.
burgeon forward.
So good. So good.
We have a couple of small novelists, Twisted Mind. Remember, they all came from books.
Absolutely. I'm going to have to read. I'm very guilty of having not read Rosemary's Baby, so I would love to read it one day. Yeah, I'm going to have to. Amazing. Jen, thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks for having me.
So much to say about this film, but I think we did well there, considering the amount of ground we had to cover. Where can people find you out there in the world, Jen?
I am at Jen Handorf on Twitter. Hit me with questions for film or life. I will do the best I can. And I'm looking forward to bringing you guys a couple of little exciting things on the horizon. So do have a little look out.
Anything you can tell us yet, or is it still too early?
I'm going to say one word. menopause. And leave it at that.
Great.
If half your audience aren't terrified, then they've not read up enough.
Let's leave it at that. Amazing. Thank you very much. And that's it for this week. Thank you so much for listening, and a big thank you to my brilliant guest, Jen Handorf. Always such a pleasure to chat movies with Jen. So get in touch. What did you think of this week's episode? What are your opinions on separating the art from the artist? And what's your opinion on Rosemary's Baby? I'd love to hear your thoughts. Please do get in touch. The email address is evolutionofhorror@gmail.com. You can find us on Facebook, on Twitter, on Instagram. You can also find us on Letterboxd. That's where we reveal what movies we're going to be covering for the rest of the series. So if you want to get involved and watch the movies week by week with us, then be sure to follow us on Letterboxd. That's letterboxd.com/evolutionpod. You can find all previous episodes of this podcast on our website. Simply go to evolutionofhorror.com. We're also going to be encouraging more writers to write in with written pieces. If you want to write something for the blog, a thought piece or a review or an essay, anything you like, please do email us, evolutionofhorror@gmail.com, with any ideas. We'd love to put more written work up on our website when we can. If you want to support the cost of making this podcast, you can simply sign up to our Patreon channel. That's patreon.com/evolutionofhorror. If you sign up to that and donate $5 per month, that's about £3.80 per month, you will have access to weekly bonus episodes and a whole back catalogue. I think there are about 50 bonus episodes now that you can listen to. So one more time, simply go to patreon.com/evolutionofhorror and get involved. You can find this podcast on all major podcast platforms, including iTunes, Podbean, Spotify, Libsyn, and various others. Please do subscribe to us. Please do spread the word about us. And if you get a chance, if you get a spare minute, I'd be so grateful if you could just drop us a little rating or review on Apple Podcasts or whatever app you use. It just helps give the podcast a boost and helps us get discovered by new listeners. So next week then, it's an exciting one next week. Now this filmmaker was kind of new to me. I hadn't really delved into his work until getting into this series on the occult, and I'm so excited to discuss it. Next week I'm going to be joined by the brilliant Charlie Albright, and we're going to be discussing the work of Kenneth Anger, specifically his short film from the 1970s called Lucifer Rising. Now the film itself is a short film. I think it's only about 30 minutes max, and it's actually on YouTube. If you search for Kenneth Anger Lucifer Rising on YouTube, you can find the whole film and watch it on there. But I would also recommend, there's a fantastic little box set actually. There is a DVD in which you can get a collection of all of Kenneth Anger's short films. Now we'll mainly be discussing Lucifer Rising on the podcast next week, but Charlie will also be recommending other works by Kenneth Anger as well, and we may touch upon some of the others like Scorpio Rising very briefly. So that's your homework for next week. Kenneth Anger, Lucifer Rising. Cannot wait. Join us next week for all of this and more on the Evolution of Horror.